Good morning, class. So for today, we will continue our discussion about addition of vector quantities. As we learned from our previous lesson, vector quantities are quantities with both magnitude and direction. And how do we get the sum or resultant of two or more vectors? There are several methods, okay? So first is graphical method, wherein we draw the vector uh, represented by arrows, and the magnitude of the vector is proportional to the length of the arrow. Another method is the component method, which is what we will discuss today. So we can always use either these two methods or both methods, okay? Graphical and component method. In the component method, the Pythagorean theorem will be useful to us. Okay? Actually, this method is based on the right triangle. Okay? So, in a right triangle, you have the hypotenuse and the two legs. The right angle is here. The angle here, we call it theta. So, theta is our reference angle. So, it is measured from the horizontal x-axis. Okay? Opposite theta is this side. So we call it the opposite side. And adjacent to theta, we have the adjacent side here. Okay? And of course, you have the hypotenuse here. So we will discuss this in detail later on. But let me give you a brief overview of what is the component method all about. So, how do we perform the component method? Or how does it works? Okay? So first is we are resolving the x and y components of each vector. So the idea here is that every vector has two components, x and y. Okay? Second, we get the sum of all the x components and the sum of all the y components. And then third, we apply the Pythagorean theorem to get the magnitude of the resultant. And last, we get the direction of the resultant. So using the tangent function. Okay? So, so going back to our right triangle, in the component method, we contend that the hypotenuse is our vector. Okay? And therefore, you will have a right triangle. And a right triangle always have two legs. One leg is horizontal, the other leg is vertical. Okay? So ganun yung ating pattern. Kumbaga class, yung vector na involved ay kino-consider natin siya na siya yung hypotenuse ng isang right triangle. So, the sine, cosine, and tangent function will be useful to us. We have what we call SOHCAHTOA. So, this is a mnemonic or technique para mas matandaan natin yung steps or methods. So refers to sine theta is equal to opposite over hypotenuse. Okay? So remember, theta is our angle here. And you have opposite divided by the hypotenuse. Next, Cosine theta is equal to adjacent over hypotenuse. And next, tangent theta is equal to opposite over adjacent. Okay? Now, I'm going to write some discussion on our Jamboard. Okay? So you have a right triangle. You have the hypotenuse, let's say h, and the two legs adjacent and opposite. And this is our angle theta. Okay? So in the component method, like I said before, we consider a vector as the hypotenuse. And therefore, it is if the vector is the hypotenuse, it has two legs. Okay? Bakit tinawag na component method? Kasi yung dalawang leg ay magiging horizontal and vertical components or x component and y component. Okay? So let's say we have a vector v. So let me draw a Cartesian plane. Okay? Horizontal and vertical axis. So let's say we have a vector v and this is how it looks. Ayan, let's say that's a vector v. Okay? Since we consider it as a hypotenuse of a right triangle, therefore, vector v will have two legs. So, nasaan yung two legs niya? Saan siya, ano ang kanyang x-coordinate? Okay? So, ito yung kanyang magiging ah, horizontal leg at ito naman yung kanyang magiging, sorry class ha, vertical leg. So, you have the horizontal leg will be the x component. So, let us label it b sub x. And the vertical leg will be the y component. So, let's label it b sub y. Okay? By the way, the proper way of writing vector in symbol is we have an arrow on top. Okay, let's put an arrow on top of this vector. Okay? So, okay na kahit wala dito sa component niya. So, vector B has two components, x component and y component, similar to the hypotenuse of a right triangle, which has two legs, horizontal and vertical leg. And also, this is our angle theta. So, applying our method called SOHCAHTOA, okay, you have sine theta is equal to opposite over adjacent. So if this is our theta, the opposite side is v sub y. Opposite over hypotenuse, class. Okay? So the opposite side is v sub y and the hypotenuse is v. Then the next part, ka. Cosine theta is equal to adjacent over hypotenuse. So the adjacent side is v sub x, the hypotenuse is v. And the third part, TOA. Tangent theta is equal to opposite over adjacent. So you have v sub y over v sub x. So these three formulas will be very useful to us. Okay? So, how do we use this formula in the component method? In order to get the y component v sub y, okay, you will derive for v sub y. So v sub y, okay, will be equal to, you can put a denominator 1 here and cross multiply. So v sub y is equal to v times sine theta. Okay? Now let's get the x component. Okay, ganun din. V sub x will be equal to v times cosine theta. Okay. So that's our formula to get the x and the y component. And then, how do we use the tangent here? This is used in getting the direction of the vector. So, we will get the theta or the angle. How do we get the angle? So, pwede natin itong magamitin para makuha ilang degrees ito. Okay? So, how do we get that angle? Theta will be equal to, ililipat mo yung tangent sa kabila. Okay? So, pag nilipat mo yung tangent sa kabila, magiging inverse tangent. Okay? And then, times v sub y over v sub x. Okay? Okay. So, let's have an example. Okay, in which we will apply this method. So, in our module, in page 30, we have the problem in flash check. So, sabi dito, find the resultant of the following vectors. So, you have the first vector, d1. So, since this is displacement, okay, we symbolize this as d1 is equal to 36 meter, 34 degrees. The second vector, d2, is equal to 23 meter, 116 degrees. Okay? So you have the two vectors. Okay? So find the resultant vector. So kasama na yung magnitude and direction. So class, pwede nating i-drawing ito, okay? Graphical method. Pwede muna tayo mag-graphical method. Okay? Para mas madali nating ma-solve yung problem. So, if we will perform a graphical method, so we always start with our Cartesian plane. Okay? Sorry kung hindi pantay ha. You have the origin here. So, D1 is 36 meter, 34 degrees. So, paano yung 34 degrees? So, our reference for angle is the positive x-axis. Okay? So, ito yung 0 degree. Tapos, paikot tayo counterclockwise. 0, 90, 180, 270, 360. Okay? So, if we will draw this, and we use a protractor, so 0 degree ito, may measure ka ng angle 34 degree from the positive x. So let's say iyan. And then you draw the 36 meter. Okay? So kayo na bahala sa inyong scale. So this is your D1. Okay? Paano naman yung D2? So dito tayo magsisimula sa head nung D1. Okay, pwede kang mag-drawing ng imaginary Cartesian plane, mas maliit. Then, since 116 degree, ganun din. So, from the positive x axis, magme-measure ka ng 116 degree using the protractor. So, from here, gaganyan ka. Lalampas ka ng 90 para ma-reach mo yung 116. So, let's say more or less dyan. So, ito yung 116 degrees mo. Then, you draw the vector 23 meter. Let's say, yeah. So, this will be your D2. Okay? And then, how do you get the resultant? You will connect the origin to the final position. Ayan. And of course, the arrow is pointing to the final position. And then you will measure it with your ruler, and using the scale that you use, you will get how many meters is this. So that's the magnitude. Then you will use the protractor to get the angle here. And that will be the direction. Okay? How many degrees yan. So that's how you apply the graphical method here. Okay? Now, let's apply the component method. So, the first step is we will get the x and y component of D1 and D2. So, let's solve for D1 first. So, the x component of D1, so let's symbolize it as D1x is equal to D1 cosine theta. Okay, di ba? From our formula. And then the y component of D1, so D1y, is equal to D1 sine theta. Okay? So, let's solve. That will be 36 meter times cosine 34 degree. And this one will be 36 meter sine 34 degree. Okay, let's compute. 36 times cosine 34. So that is 29.84. Okay, we can all write the unit already. 29.84 meter. And then 36 times sine 34. So you got 20.13 meter. So that's the x and y component of D1. Now let's get the x and y component of D2. So we use the same process. So D2x will be D2 times cosine 116 degrees. And D2y is equal to D2, sorry. Let's write the value already. Okay, let's write the value already. So D2 is 23 meter. Okay, so 23 meter times cosine 116 for dy, 23 meter times sine 116 degree. Okay, so let's compute. 23 times cosine 116. Okay, you got negative 10.08 meter. And then for the y component, 23 times sine 116. You will get 20.67 meter. Okay. So for the x component, negative. Okay. For the y is positive. So bakit kaya ganun class? So yung D2, ito yung D2, di ba? D2 lies on the second quadrant. Okay, di ba ito first quadrant, second, third, and fourth. So sa second quadrant, negative ang x at positive ang y. So kaya negative ang lumabas dito. Okay? Yung D1 naman, si D1 ay nasa first quadrant, kaya parehong positive. Okay? So yon. Okay, now we have the x and y components of each vectors. We will now get the sum of all the x component and sum of all the y components. So the summation of all the x will be yung x component ng D1 plus x component ng D2. Okay, so you got 29.84 plus negative 10.08. Okay, since negative siya, magiging minus 29.84 minus 10.08. You will get 19.76. Okay, you can write meter. And then the sum of all the y. Yan. So you have 20.13 and 20.67. Okay? Okay. The result will be 40.8 meter. Okay? So that's the sum of all the x and the sum of all the y. Okay, now we will now apply the Pythagorean theorem. So in the Pythagorean theorem, okay, you have the right triangle, the hypotenuse C, the two legs A and B. And to get the hypotenuse, you have C squared is equal to A squared plus B squared. Tapos, you will get the square root para makuha mo yung hypotenuse. Okay? So, looking back on our previous discussion, when we resolve the vector into a right triangle, it's like the vector is the hypotenuse C, the two legs, the x and y component are the two legs. So Vx is equivalent to A, Vy is equivalent to B. Okay? So applying this one to our problem, our resultant, so this is our resultant, diba, based on the graphical method. So our resultant will be the square root of summation of all the x squared plus summation of all the y squared. So in this method, like I said before, the vector is assumed as the hypotenuse of the right triangle. Okay? So kaya dito siya galing, di ba? And the two legs of the right triangle are assumed as the x component or summation of all the x and the summation of all the y. So they are equivalent to the two legs of the right triangle. Okay, so let's continue the solution. So you will have the resultant r. So actually class, wala pa itong direction. So pwede nating tanggalin yung arrow kasi magnitude lang siya. Okay, kahit wala pang arrow. So r will be square root of 19.76 squared plus 40.8 squared. Okay? So using the calculator, square root of 19.76 squared plus 40.8 squared. So you will get 45.33. Okay? Or we can round it up to 45 meter. So that's the resultant or the magnitude of the resultant. Okay, so this is equal to 45 meter. So kung nag-graphical method tayo and you measure it with your ruler, that will be equivalent to 45 meter. So how about the direction? Kung nag-graphical method tayo, you will measure it with the protractor, di ba? And you will get the direction. Paano kung component method tayo? Okay? So gagamitin na natin yung tangent. Okay? So how do we get the direction? Okay, from our previous board, ito. Okay, so theta is equal to inverse tangent of the y component divided by the x. So in our case, in our problem, okay, saan tayo magsusulat? Dito na lang class. So theta will be equal to the inverse tangent of summation of all the y over summation of all the x. Okay, so theta will be the inverse tangent of 40.8 over 19.76. Okay? So how do we do that in our calculator? Pwede nyo i-divide muna yung 40.8 by 19.76. Yun. And then you get the inverse tangent. How do you get the inverse tangent? You have the sine, cosine, and tangent, di ba? Paano yung inverse tangent? Sa Casio calculator, you have the shift function. So you will press the shift, tapos tangent. Para ang gagawin niya ay yung inverse tangent. Okay? So shift, tangent. Tapos yung quotient, yung summation of all the x and the y. So ang lalabas dito ay 64.15 or 64 degrees. So therefore, our angle theta or the angle of the resultant is 64 degrees. So yun, kung nag-graphical method tayo, more or less 64 degrees ang makukuha mo dyan. Okay, now, our final answer will be the resultant is equal to 45 meter, 64 degrees. Okay, so that's our complete answer. Okay, so uh, that's it for the uh, component method of finding the resultant of two or more vectors. Okay, so um, actually this is a basic skill, okay, in physics. Not only in physics, but also this is actually part of mathematics also. Okay, so this is useful in finding the resultant of two or more vectors. And this method can be applied to any vector. Okay, so in our example, our vector is displacement. So, pwede rin siyang gawin sa force. Okay? So, kasi force is also a vector quantity. Okay, so I hope you learned something from today's discussion. And I hope this video uh, is helpful for you to understand the methods and for you to answer the module successfully. Okay? So thank you for your time and keep safe, everyone. Goodbye.